Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm David Foster. In 2 years of fighting, there have been enormous humanitarian and economic prices to pay. We will be looking at both in this programme. First, the cost to those who could and should be the future of Syria, the young. Bernard Smith visited a group of volunteers trying to help children inside the war-torn country.
For the 2,000 plus children in this camp in Syria, a donation of plastic balls is a rare treat. The only classroom is packed. The heat is suffocating. The demand for some sort of education is almost overwhelming. The man heading the project is a Syrian political cartoonist, a refugee himself, now a teacher.
We're working for Syrian children. We're not involved in the fighting and the revolution. We are trying to lay the foundations for the children's future. What we are doing now are simple projects in an emergency situation. But we hope to leave these children with a different mindset than those of past generations.
Joanne is one of a dozen young middle-class Syrian men and women helping with these classes. They describe the children as psychologically damaged by what they've witnessed in this conflict. The volunteers themselves have family living in government-controlled areas and so don't want to be filmed for fear of reprisals. These children are surrounded by conflict. Not only have they escaped the fighting in their own towns and villages, but even here in this camp, there's tension between two large families here that are armed. And in fact, today's classes have been cut short because of a fear of an outbreak of violence between those two families. We were hurried out of the camp.
We don't know if something will happen. We don't know.
The Syrian volunteers try to spend all day here, but on this trip the children got just an hour of distraction from camp life. Sometimes infighting between rebel groups means no classes at all.
Most of the people our age go work something, go to Europe, to go to Dubai for something, for work or something. We try to stay here, do something here. If all of us go, our generation, if all of us go, who will take care of these people?
On the classroom wall are reminders of what these children have left behind
and this tank
and what they've come to. The United Nations warns that 4 million young people are affected by the fighting. As the conflict drags on, more and more of them will be growing up in these overcrowded camps. Bernard Smith for Inside Syria.
Well, joining us now, Kat Carter from the charity Save the Children. Kat, I know you've been in and out of Jordan and Syria for the last 6 months, seeing these children. Were you surprised at what you found?
I was really surprised, actually. The kind of stories that these children told me, they're absolutely harrowing, and they've changed quite a lot over the last 6 months. The first time I went to Jordan was well over 6 months ago now, and when I speak to the children I spoke to last week, the levels of brutality seem to have increased again, and the kind of stories they're coming out with, it's the stuff of nightmares. You know, these children are witnessing things that no child should ever have to witness.
Are they getting any help at all?
Some help is getting through into Syria, and certainly on the border areas, but it's incredibly hard, of course, delivering aid in a war zone, particularly one as active and as brutal as Syria is at the moment. Aid agencies are able to get in, but it's very much get in, get out what you can, help as many people as you can, and then withdraw before the bombs start falling again. So it's very difficult to get aid in.
Yeah, Kat, you can deliver aid in terms of food and blankets and water and things like that. I know it's difficult, but can you deliver any help when it comes to psychological damage?
Well, and this is the key thing. The psychological damage being done by this conflict is absolutely huge. These children have lived through now over 2 years of sheer brutality. They've witnessed their parents being killed. They've witnessed massacres. In many cases, many children that I spoke to, they'd actually helped to either bury their parents, their siblings. They helped to retrieve dead bodies after horrendous incidents, massacres, bombing, shellings. This has a huge impact psychologically. And lots of parents simply don't know how to cope. I wouldn't know how to cope with a child who, is no longer speaking or cries all the time or has nightmares. What on earth would you say? Why should you know how to handle your child, how to help them be okay? So psychosocial support is so critical, and it is possible to deliver, but it's incredibly hard in a war zone because it does require long periods of time in a safe space with a child.
And can you get these children back from that terrible place, not the place where they live, but from the place where their minds are?
You can. Children are incredibly resilient, and if you do things like restore education, it seems quite simple, but actually restoring something that seems like normality, that's a regular routine, that can really help. And encouraging children to talk to each other. Often children carry this sense of guilt at what they've witnessed or what they've lived through, this feeling that somehow it's their fault that their parents were killed or one of their best friends died and not them. But if you sit a child down next to another child who's gone through the same thing and they start swapping those stories, you see something amazing happen. They start to understand they're not alone in this. It's nothing to do with them. It's not their fault. And that's one of the most powerful things we can do, is actually teach children how to talk to each other about their experiences.
But I suppose one of the most difficult things is when it comes to severe wounds. You could administer a bandage. It's clear to everybody that that person is bleeding, but when the problem is with their mental health, it becomes less of an imperative to those on the ground. Are you seeing that?
I haven't seen that actually, because I think that mental health is now prioritised by aid agencies because we know how important it is to help this generation recover. And often these things do actually manifest themselves externally as well. So I met a lot of children who were very viciously biting their nails, for example, or who couldn't sit still, having very severe nightmares, bedwetting up to the age of 13 or 14, some children who were actually just unable to speak. So you can see those telltale symptoms as well. And also some children are being very violent to each other, which again is a bit of a warning sign, particularly to aid workers. Well,
Kat Carter, we wish you all the very best. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, beside the human cost, the war in Syria has taken a severe toll on the economy, on the infrastructure there too, with the currency weakening, recession deepening and the government, to say the least, short of cash. Even finding out just how much has been destroyed will be difficult. But it is clear that the conflict has set back the country considerably and its economy is paying a terrible price. In 2010, before the uprising, Syria's gross domestic product was valued at about $60 billion, according to the World Bank. Now it's fallen to just under $33 billion, a drop of about 45%. The Syrian pound has lost about half of its value. It used to trade at about £47 to the dollar, and it now goes for about 100. Well over 150 on the black market. Homes, roads and bridges across Syria will need rebuilding. 1 in 5 schools is no longer functioning, either destroyed, used to shelter people fleeing violence or harbouring the fighters. And 1 in every 3 hospitals can no longer provide the services. Or joining us to discuss the state of Syria's economy after 2 years of war in Istanbul, Osama Kadi, who is the General Coordinator of the Syrian Economic Task Force, also a member of the Syrian National Council. In Oklahoma in the US, Joshua Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and a professor at the University of Oklahoma, and in Beirut, Jihad Yazigi, the founder and editor-in-chief of the Syria Report and online economic digest. Welcome to all three of you. Jihad Yazigi, first of all, I've got to run through some of the figures there. Here are a couple of others. Inflation in 2012, up tenfold, about 50%. International reserves down to $2 billion at the end of 2012. Can we get some kind of picture from all these numbers of what sort of state Syria is in financially?
Well, Syria's economy has been deteriorating very gradually, really, in the last 2 years. You have a number of factors behind that. The uprising in itself has led to a sharp reduction in investment and consumption. Then you have had an expansion of violence, and you have had international sanctions. Today, economic output is significantly down. Inflation is high. The currency level is also the level of the currency compared to the dollar is very low. And what we are going to see in the coming few weeks and months is a continuation of this deterioration of really all the main economic indicators. The Syrian economy is in extremely bad shape. It has lost much of its production capacity, and we are certainly talking, when we are thinking about reconstruction, of an extremely long road ahead.
Well, I was given a figure which came from Abdullah al-Dadari, former deputy premier, who reckons $80 billion to rebuild. Is that about right, or could it be more than that, in your opinion?
No, I think it's extremely difficult to give a figure today. You have more than one estimate about the cost of the damage and the cost of reconstruction. We should not forget that you have around between 30 and 40% of the country that is today not in the hands of the government and outside the scope of outside the areas that Mr. Dardari can measure, or any other people really can, where you can measure the extent of the damage. But we are certainly talking of a figure in the dozens of billions of dollars, if not above $100 billion. So it's an extremely, extremely expensive bill for Syria for the future.
Dr. Kadi, we heard there from our guest in Beirut that there are some areas of the country that are not under government control. How does the economy function in those parts of Syria?
Oh, in the liberated area, actually, the Syrian regime has no control of whatsoever, and it's really not really a good governance in all above Syrian regions. The Syrian regime actually is not really managing the Syrian economy, is trying just to keep up with the salaries of the public sector employees, which amounts of 1.3 million people there.
But what about the areas that the government doesn't control? Is the economy functioning at all well there?
In a very primitive way, yes. People are trying to get their foods from the relief and humanitarian aid to that areas through Turkish borders and sometimes through Jordanian ones. So they are actually barely making it there. There are a shortage of electricity, water, and diesel for sure, and medicine. So it's actually the standard of living is very, very low. The not liberated area is not really a better shape by much. Still, they have the same thing. They have the same shortage. To my surprise, the loaf of bread is half price in liberated area and even less than the areas that under control of the regime. But as in all Syria, actually, all 23 million Syrians right now are really suffering big time because of this crisis and because of the striking of the Syrian regime against people, burning the wheat crop by the Syrian regime, killing the employees there, especially in the rural areas, trying to even deferring by such a crisis all the private businesses, industrialists left the country because of such a worse, the worst shape of Syrian economy for.
Let me ask Josh Landis a question here. We'll talk about the banking sector and the other big factors in the economy in just a moment, if we can. But the smaller businesses, a figure I got was that 9,000 small businesses in Aleppo have gone under. This is hurting the ordinary Syrian people, not just in terms of what they can rely on from the state, but for what they can provide for their families with their jobs as well.
Absolutely. One of the great disappointments in this revolution is that the liberated areas and the revolutionary forces have not unified. There are over 1,000 militias in Syria, and this lack of unity has led to a complete breakdown in the economy in the liberated areas, which causes great distress to Damascus and to many of the cities that haven't been conquered yet. So looking forward to being conquered is not something that they relish. And most of the factories around Aleppo, which are in the hundreds, have been completely dismantled and sold off. The machinery has been taken. My brother-in-law had a small clothing factory in Aleppo, 60 sewing machines and so forth. It had to close down once international sanctions were imposed, but the generator, all the sewing machines, everything was robbed from the factory, and that's been the story right across the Aleppo front. And so most of the trucks, a friend of mine who exports from Turkey said that there are more Turkish trucks going into Aleppo and through Bab el-Hawa, the big to big crossing than there ever were before. And in fact, the entire north of Syria is becoming really an appendage to the Turkish economy. And that's one of the new things that I think we're seeing, is that there's regional economies are beginning to develop with new patterns of trade. The government areas are looking towards Lebanon. They are shifting towards the port cities. The north of the country is shifting towards Turkey. And you're getting different local economies that are growing up.
Mr. Yazigi, you argue in your report, your online report, that going back to what Josh Landis just said, that countries such as Lebanon, although hurting at the moment because of what's happening in Syria, could eventually benefit from it.
Yes, well, you know, when the time of reconstruction will come, you know, Syria will be in need of capital, of supplies of various sorts of products, of manpower and know-how, and of course Lebanon is one of the countries that is best positioned to take benefit of that. You have estimates that demand for cement, for instance, will be at an annual level of around 30 million tons when the war ends, from a level of 9 million tons prior to the uprising. And obviously, Lebanese cement or building materials industry is in a very good position to take benefit from that. But again, here we are all talking of a situation of you know, when the conflict will end, and I think we are pretty far from here, from that point.
Indeed,
but of course, Lebanon.
It is a matter of when. Now, let me go to Dr. Kadi on this one. Estimates are that the Syrian farming industry has lost round about 100 billion Syrian pounds, which, depending on the exchange rate, is between $1 billion US and $2 billion US. That the banking system is close to collapse, and the banking system itself, even before the uprising, was pretty decrepit and unmodernized. Do you have a plan as part of the opposition? Do you have a plan to put the economy back together again?
We actually at Syrian Economic Task Force, we did many workshops and research about each sector, and we are planning to have at least 15 reports in each sectors. We published so far a report about agriculture, water, monetary and fiscal policy, and about the housing. And in each sector, that's written by Syrians for sure, and being reviewed by international and Syrian expertise, we put a plan for the first 6 months and the first 2 years and the first 5 years after the collapsing of the Syrian regime. I need just to remind everybody here that before the revolution, Syria was not really in good shape anyway. It was on a state failed index. Syria ranked 48th. So we are the worst 50 countries.
But in terms of growth in the Arab Middle East region, I mean, it had annual growth of round about 4.5%, which wasn't the average. It was slightly lower than the average.
But
it wasn't regarded as bad.
That's what they claim.
It wasn't regarded as bad, perhaps a little bit out of touch, according to many economists.
Actually, most of the numbers that been like produced and marketed by some economists close to the government, such as Dardari, who was with the regime, and still he is allying with the regime till now. He's trying to have draw a nice picture of the regime as then, and then the regime himself kick him out because of his worse management of the economy. So I think I maybe disagree with you. The economy was not in a good shape. We Syrians were 50% of them under poverty line. This is before the revolution. In economic freedom index, we were 144 out of 170.
Josh
so
Landis,
we are not really in a good shape.
Josh Landis,
and good governance.
Help me with a couple of points here. Gas oil prices have almost doubled, and yet civil servants' salaries are going up by about 40%, between 10 and 40%. How's that working?
Well, it's devastating everybody, and the real scary part is that 90% of oil export, Syria, 40% of Syria's government receipts came from oil exports. Oil is down and gas is down by over 90%. So there isn't much income being generated. in the country. And this has completely clobbered people. What is very scary is looking forward to this coming winter. Because agriculture has fallen so badly, there is very little fertilizer. The transportation system is broken down. There is no capital. There's very few loans from banks. Farmers are not planting. And this means that next winter is going to be long, it's going to be difficult, and there's likely to be new waves of immigration and refugees pouring out of Syria, particularly if the United States and West are pouring in more arms and the fighting increases, because you'll have both refugees coming out because of food insecurity and because of actual insecurity because of wartime situation. And that, we've got an endless horizon here of bad news, because nothing good has happened on the political front that could point in the direction of some kind of end of this civil war.
I'd like to broaden this out a little bit to other countries. We've mentioned Lebanon, but let's talk about some other countries in just a moment. In an interview with the Financial Times, Syria's Deputy Prime Minister for the Economy, Qadri Jamil, said, "It's not that bad to have behind you the Russians, the Chinese and the Iranians. Those three countries are helping us politically, militarily and also economically. Now we have a straight line between the Syrian pound and those three currencies, and we have got to get out of the circle of euros and dollars." Syrian Deputy Prime Minister for the Economy also describing the economic situation as complicated and very difficult, but he added, "Still, we have not reached the point of no return." Let's go to Beirut now. This Deputy Prime Minister also said there would be a, quote, counter-offensive involving these countries, China, Syria, China, Russia and Iran in particular. To what do you think he was referring?
Well, David, one important development, I think, which is increasing the dependency of Syria on Iran, and that hasn't been mentioned much, is the fact that in the spring of this year, you have seen a takeover by the opposition of most of the northeast of the country, what we call in Syria the Jazeera area. Basically, the northeast of the country is where all of Syria's oil wealth is located, and where most of its grain and other agricultural outputs products are grown. And what this is leading to is that it is forcing the government to import oil products. The Minister of Oil recently said...
But what sort of counter-offensive, his words, counter-offensives do you think he was referring to?
Well, David, I don't think you have to take, I'm not sure what he really mentions. What we know for sure, though, is that, the central bank governor said that Iran had provided a credit line of $7 billion to Syria to help it import products and help it finance or defend the value of the Syrian pound.
And Dr.
So that's
Kadi,
what probably he was referring to.
That line of credit coming from Iran, perhaps from other countries, is going to make your struggle a longer and tougher one? Do you think it will help prop up President Assad's regime?
Oh, actually, it will make this crisis, it takes longer and longer. And actually, part of the propaganda that Qadri Jamil and other officials, Syrian officials of that allies with the Syrian regimes, always have mixed messages. At one time, they say this is the worst crisis like for decades. The other message will be that we are very strong and we are actually having very well supported by Iran and Russia. I want to just add here one thing, that even with that line of credit, when Wael Halqi, the Prime Minister, went 3 months ago to Iran, that line of credit actually was specifically for certain projects on the coast of Syria, where the Bashar al-Assad born. So it was not really good.
Dr. Kadi, I'm sorry, I do need to get a thought from Joshua Landis on this before we wrap up this edition of Inside Syria. If both sides are receiving considerable sums of money from outside, will that be enough to keep them doing what they're doing, prolonging the conflict for the foreseeable future?
Well, that's the trouble. This is becoming a real proxy war. And one fears that President Obama, in his statement that he's going to supply lethal weapons to the rebels, he doesn't really going to help them win. He wants to hurt Hezbollah and Iran. That's the indication, is he's worried that once Hezbollah jumped into this fight, Iran upped the ante. He could not let them win. And this leads to really the worst of all worlds for Syrians, because the West is going to support the rebels with just enough to keep them fighting, and the East is going to support Iran and Russia and Iraq and Hezbollah are going to support the government, but with not enough to win this battle. So we get a stalemate that goes on and on into the horizon, and an increasingly failing economy, more refugees coming out. And that's the picture that you can't help but draw today. And where a break in this comes, how we see a change, is unknown today.
Joshua Landis, we thank you very much indeed, talking to us from Oklahoma. Osama Kadi in Istanbul and Jihad Yazigi out of Beirut, our three guests on this edition of Inside Syria. And thank you for joining us on this programme. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive coverage of what is going on inside Syria, not just on this programme, but with our news broadcasts and online too at aljazeera.com. That is aljazeera.com. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team on Inside Syria, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.